My mother's funeral was on a Thursday, which felt wrong somehow. She always said Thursdays were the most forgettable day of the week, the kind of day nothing important should happen on. She would have hated it. She also would have hated the flower arrangement my sister chose: white lilies, stiff and overpriced, the kind you ordered online when you wanted to look like you cared without actually thinking about it. My mother grew dahlias in her backyard for 30 years, not a single dahlia in sight. I stood near the back of the room and watched my sister work the crowd. That's the only word for it. She moved from cluster to cluster with her hand pressed to her chest, her eyes glistening on cue, her husband Derek hovering just close enough to look supportive without saying much. They were good at this. The performance of grief. I had spent enough time around both of them to know the difference between my sister feeling something and my sister wanting you to believe she was feeling something. My mother had been 74. She'd lived in Meadowbrook Senior Care for the last 2 years after her second hip surgery left her too unsteady to manage the house alone. She wasn't frail. She wasn't fading. She did the crossword every morning, called me every Sunday, and had opinions about everything from the neighbor's landscaping to the direction of the country. Then, 3 weeks ago, the nursing home called to say she'd had a cardiac episode in her sleep, gone before anyone could reach her. The doctor signed off on it. Natural causes. She was 74. I told myself that was enough of an explanation. I almost believed it. I was making my way toward the exit, done with handshakes and sorry for your losses, when a man in a gray suit stepped directly into my path with the kind of quiet purpose that said he'd been waiting for the right moment. He introduced himself as Gerald Hollis, my mother's attorney. I hadn't known she had one, which already made my stomach tighten. He was older, mid-60s, with reading glasses tucked into his breast pocket and the kind of careful, measured voice that comes from decades of delivering difficult news. He said he was sorry for my loss. He meant it, which made what came next worse. He said he needed to speak with me privately, away from the reception, and that it couldn't wait until after the service. I followed him to a small side hallway near the coat room, where the noise from the main room dropped to a low hum. He told me my mother had come to his office 3 months ago. She had asked him to hold a sealed envelope for her. She had been specific about the instructions. If anything happened to her before she resolved a private matter, the envelope was to go directly to me. Not to my sister. Not to Derek. Only to me. He reached into his jacket and handed me the envelope. My mother's handwriting was on the front, my name in her careful cursive, the same way she'd addressed birthday cards my entire life. He said one more thing before he stepped back. He said, "Whatever is in that letter, I think you should read it somewhere your sister cannot see your face." I looked down at the envelope. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I didn't open it there. I put it in my purse, thanked him, and walked back into the reception like nothing had shifted. My sister caught my eye from across the room and smiled, warm and practiced. Derek gave me a small nod. I nodded back. I stayed another 40 minutes. I hugged people I barely recognized. I said my mother had been a wonderful woman, which was true. I did not look at my purse. I did not let my expression change. When I finally got to my car, I sat in the parking lot of the funeral home with the engine off and opened the envelope. My mother's letter was 2 pages, front and back, written in her small, neat hand. She hadn't wasted words. She said she hoped she was being paranoid. She said she had always trusted my sister completely, had never had a reason not to. But 6 months ago, she had started noticing things. Small amounts missing from the account she used for her personal expenses at the nursing home, the one my sister managed under her power of attorney. Then, larger amounts. Then a payment she didn't recognize to something called Lakeview Property Holdings, a name she had never heard and never authorized. She said she had tried to ask my sister about it twice. Both times, my sister had an explanation. Both times, the explanation felt too smooth, like something rehearsed rather than remembered. She said she had started keeping notes. She had written down every discrepancy, every date, every amount. She had given copies to Mr. Hollis. She had also written down something else. In the last month, she said, she had been feeling strange. Not sick exactly, not in any way the nurses could easily point to. Just off. Foggy. Tired in a way that was different from her usual tired. Her medication had been adjusted 3 times in 4 months, each time by an order my sister had co-signed as her healthcare proxy. She had asked the head nurse to explain the changes. The nurse had been vague. She wrote, "I don't know if I am being dramatic. I don't know if this is old age or something else. But I know your sister and Derek owe money to people I have never met. And I know my accounts are not what they were, and I know that I feel worse than I should. If I am wrong about all of this, then forgive me and forget this letter existed. But if something happens to me before I can find out the truth, I need you to be the one who looks." At the bottom she had written, "I love you. I'm sorry I didn't call you sooner. I was afraid of being wrong about my own daughter." I sat in the parking lot for a long time. Long enough that the other cars thinned out around me, and the sky started going orange at the edges. Then I folded the letter carefully, put it back in the envelope, put the envelope in the inside pocket of my jacket, and drove home. I worked in healthcare administration, not a nurse, not a doctor, but 7 years coordinating patient records and insurance compliance had given me enough working knowledge to understand what a medication change looked like on paper, and when it didn't add up. That night, I pulled out my laptop and submitted a records request through the nursing home's patient portal. As my mother's secondary emergency contact, I had limited access, not everything, but enough to see the surface. What I could see stopped me cold. In the 4 months before her death, my mother's blood pressure medication had been increased twice. Her sleep aid had been added, then doubled. A secondary medication had been introduced in the last 6 weeks that I didn't recognize at all. Each order had a cosigner, my sister's name, every time. I looked up the medication I didn't recognize. It took me 20 minutes to find it in the right context, buried in a pharmaceutical database I had bookmarked years ago for insurance work. It was not a standard medication for a woman my mother's age with her documented conditions. At higher doses, it could cause cardiac stress. At sustained doses, over weeks, it could trigger an episode that looked, to a reviewing physician, like natural heart failure in an elderly patient. My hands were shaking when I closed the laptop. I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table and made a list of everything I knew, everything my mother had written, and every question I couldn't answer yet. When daylight came through the window, I had 3 pages of notes and a very clear sense of what I needed to do next. I called Mr. Hollis first thing in the morning. I told him I had read the letter. I told him what I had found in the records. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told me he had already made copies of everything my mother had given him. He had been waiting to see if I called. He said there was more he hadn't put in the envelope because my mother hadn't wanted to frighten me until I could see it for myself. He told me to come to his office that afternoon. He told me to come alone. When I arrived, he had a file on his desk 3 inches thick. My mother had been thorough in a way that made my chest ache, because being thorough had always been her nature, and the idea of her sitting alone in her room at Meadowbrook, frightened and methodical, carefully documenting what she feared her own daughter was doing to her was almost more than I could hold. The financials were the clearest part. $32,000 had been moved out of the estate account over 14 months in transfers my mother had never authorized. Another $18,000 had gone to Lakeview Property Holdings, which Mr. Hollis had looked up. It was an LLC registered 6 months ago. The registered agent was Derek. My brother-in-law had created a company and used my mother's money to fund it while she was alive, and while my sister held power of attorney. My mother had caught it. And then she had started feeling sick. Mr. Hollis also had something else. A voicemail my mother had left on his office line 2 weeks before she died. She had called after hours, when she knew the machine would pick up. Her voice on the recording was low and careful, like she was worried about being overheard. She said she had tried to stop taking one of her medications because it made her feel wrong in a way she couldn't describe to the nurses. She said my sister had come in the next day and spoken to the nursing staff, and the medication had been reinstated. She said she had not asked for it to be reinstated. She said, "If I stop being able to call you, please make sure my younger daughter knows what I told you." I listened to the recording twice. Then I asked Mr. Hollis to make me a copy of everything in that file. He had already prepared one. He had been waiting for me. The detective I spoke to the following morning was thorough and unhurried, which I appreciated. Her name was Renata Voss, and she worked financial crimes at the county level but had handled cases that crossed into elder abuse before. She listened to everything I brought her without interrupting once. When I finished, she looked at the file for a long moment and then looked at me. She said the financial piece was actionable, She said the medical piece was going to require a medical examiner's review, which she would initiate immediately. She said she wanted to move carefully because she wanted to move once, with everything in place, rather than alert anyone too soon. She told me not to discuss any of this with my sister. She told me to act as normally as I could manage. She said the hardest part of these cases was usually the waiting, and that she was sorry I was going to have to do some of it. I thanked her, shook her hand, and drove to my mother's house, where I had been staying to sort through her belongings. I was supposed to be managing the estate. My sister had offered to help. I had told her I had it handled. That evening, my sister called. She asked how I was doing, how the house felt, whether I had eaten anything real that day. She asked if I had heard from Mr. Hollis recently. The question slipped in smooth and light, barely distinguishable from the ones around it. I told her I had stopped by his office to sign some routine paperwork. She said, "Oh," and then told me that she and Derek were planning to come by the house Saturday to help go through Mom's things. She said it in the tone of someone who had already decided. I said that would be fine. I said I'd see her Saturday. After I hung up, I sat on my mother's couch with my mother's reading lamp on and understood for the first time what it meant to perform normalcy for someone who was performing grief at you. Saturday came. My sister arrived with Derek and 2 large empty boxes, which told me something about what she expected to leave with. They came in through the front door like they owned the floor plan. My sister immediately moving toward the back bedroom where my mother kept her jewelry and her documents. Derek hanging back in the kitchen, opening cabinets with the cheerful efficiency of someone inventorying an estate sale. I followed my sister to the bedroom. She was at the closet before I reached the doorway. Her hand already on the wooden box my mother kept on the top shelf, the one with the silver clasp. The one my mother had told me years ago held her important papers and the emerald ring that had belonged to her own mother. I said, "I already went through that." My sister's hand paused. She turned around with a smile. "I was just going to help organize," she said. "Mom had so much tucked in random places." I said, "I know. I've been cataloging everything." Detective Voss asked me to keep track of the inventory. The smile didn't disappear. It recalibrated. She said, "Who is Detective Voss?" I said, "She's handling some of the financial questions around Mom's estate. Apparently there are some irregularities that need to be reviewed before anything is distributed." My sister set the wooden box back on the shelf, slowly, like she was making a decision about how to hold her face. She said, "What kind of irregularities?" I said, "I don't know the details yet." She said it would probably take a few weeks. Behind me, I could hear Derek's footsteps stop in the kitchen. The cabinet he had been opening swung shut. My sister came toward me then, and the warmth in her expression was gone, replaced by something older and less patient. She said, "I handled Mom's finances for 2 years. I did everything right. If someone is suggesting otherwise, they're going to have a hard time proving it." I said I was sure it would all get sorted out. She stared at me for a count of 3. Then she called Derek's name and said they were leaving. She walked past me through the hallway without touching me, without looking back. Derek followed close behind, the boxes still empty in his hands. At the door, my sister stopped. She said, "You always made things complicated, even when we were kids." I said, "I learned from watching other people." They left. I locked the door behind them, stood in the hallway of my mother's house, and breathed. My phone buzzed an hour later. A text from my sister. "We need to talk about this properly, not through lawyers. Can you come over tonight?" Then another. "Mom would have wanted us to handle this as a family." Then a third. "If you're doing what I think you're doing, you need to stop. You don't understand the full picture." I sent one reply. "I'll call you tomorrow." Detective Voss called me that evening. The medical examiner had completed a preliminary review of my mother's records. The sustained levels of the cardiac stressing medication in the weeks before her death were significantly above what her body should have been receiving based on her documented weight and cardiac history. The examiner was classifying the manner of death as undetermined pending further review, which in practice meant the natural causes designation was no longer going to hold. Voss told me my sister and Derek had also, within the last 2 hours, attempted to access my mother's estate account at the bank. The account had been frozen as part of the financial inquiry. A bank employee had flagged the attempt. Voss said, "They're starting to move." She said she needed something on record. She asked if I was willing to meet with my sister, controlled environment, with audio documentation, to let them speak freely in a way that could be captured. I said yes before she finished the sentence. She told me to suggest a neutral location, somewhere public, somewhere I chose. She told me she would have 2 officers positioned nearby. She told me to let my sister drive the conversation and not to fill silences. I texted my sister and told her we should meet at the coffee shop 2 blocks from the community center. Neutral ground, I said. I said I didn't want to do this at anyone's house. She agreed in under a minute. The coffee shop was quiet when I arrived Tuesday evening. I chose a corner table that let me see the door. The device Voss had given me was small enough that it disappeared under the neckline of my sweater, exactly where she had shown me to place it. My sister came in with Derek. I hadn't expected him. She hadn't mentioned him. They sat across from me. My sister folded her hands on the table and looked at me with an expression I recognized from childhood. The one she used when she was about to explain something to me as if I were slow. She said, "I know you found some of Mom's notes. Mr. Hollis called me." That was not true. Hollis had given me no indication he had contacted my sister, and the look on her face when she said it told me she was testing whether I would correct her. I didn't. I said, "What do you want me to do?" She said, "We want you to drop the inquiry with the detective. We want you to let the estate close normally." I said, "Why?" Derek leaned forward. He said, "Because what's done is done. Your mother is gone. Dragging this into a legal investigation doesn't bring her back, and it destroys the family." I said, "What is done, exactly?" My sister's jaw tightened. She said, "The finances were complicated. Mom didn't always understand what she was authorizing. I was managing a lot, and sometimes things didn't get documented the way they should have." I said, $50,000 of undocumented transactions. She didn't flinch. She said, "We were in a difficult situation. Derek's business needed a bridge. We were going to pay it back." Derek said, "It wasn't stealing, it was a loan from family." I said, "Did she know it was a loan?" Silence. I said, "Did she agree to it?" My sister said, "She would have, if we had asked her the right way." I held her gaze. I said, "And the medication?" The word landed between us like something breakable. My sister said, "What about it?" I said, "Her dosage was adjusted 4 times in 4 months. The last medication added was not indicated for her condition. Her own doctor didn't order it. You co-signed every change." My sister's face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds, each one a decision being made. She finally landed on controlled anger. She said, "You are not a doctor. You have no idea what her condition required." The nursing home physicians approved every order. Derek said, more quietly, "You need to let this go. You keep pushing, and you're going to end up with nothing. No family, no inheritance, nothing." I said, "Is that a warning?" He said, "It's the truth." My sister said, "We took care of her. For 2 years, we were the ones there every week. You visited 4 times. 4 times in 2 years. Don't sit across from me and act like you're the one who loved her more." That one was designed to hit something soft, and it did, for exactly the 3 seconds I allowed it before I remembered what was in the voicemail my mother had left for her attorney. She had called after hours because she was afraid of being overheard. She had been afraid in her own room, in the place where she was supposed to be cared for. I said, "She left me a letter." My sister went still. I said, "She wrote it 3 months before she died." She described everything. The accounts, the transfers, the medication changes, the way she felt wrong but couldn't prove it. She gave it to her attorney with instructions to pass it to me if anything happened. Derek's hand, resting on the table, curled slightly at the knuckles. My sister said, "That letter is not legally." I said, "It's in evidence now." The sentence stopped her completely. I said, "Everything she documented. Everything Hollis kept. The voicemail she left him. The financial records. The pharmacy logs. The medical examiner's preliminary report. All of it is with Detective Voss." My sister looked at Derek. That look, quick and small and desperate, was worth more in the recording than anything either of them had said out loud. She turned back to me. Her voice dropped to something close to a whisper. She said, "You don't know what you're doing." I said, I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm finishing what she started. My sister stood up. Derek stood immediately after, following her cue, and I noticed for the first time that it had always been that way. Derek following her lead, Derek who had the LLC and the debt, but my sister who had the power of attorney and the access and the plan. She said, "This is going to ruin everything." I said, "You ruined it. I'm just making sure there's a record." They walked out. I sat at the corner table in the quiet coffee shop and waited for my phone to ring. It took 40 seconds. Voss said, "We have it. Clear audio on everything. The admission about the finances, the medication conversation, the threat. We're moving tonight." She told me to go back to my mother's house and stay there. She said officers would be at my sister's residence within the hour. I drove back through streets that looked completely ordinary, past houses with lights on and cars in driveways, and people who had no idea that anything had changed. The world outside the car felt thin, like a backdrop, like nothing happening out there was quite real yet. What was real was the letter folded in my purse. What was real was my mother's voice on a voicemail, careful and low, afraid of being overheard in her own room. What was real was that she had trusted me to look, and I had looked, and now other people were looking too. I parked in my mother's driveway and sat with the engine off. My phone lit up 20 minutes later. Voss, both in custody. No resistance. The house is being searched under warrant. I had expected to feel something large at that moment. I didn't. What I felt was quiet. The particular quiet that comes after something has been completed. The trial took 11 days. My sister and Derek had hired separate attorneys, which told me everything about how quickly the alliance had fractured when the pressure became real. Derek's attorney spent most of the first week arguing that he had no direct role in my mother's medical care, which was technically accurate and strategically useless because the financial fraud was documented so thoroughly that it made everything else plausible by design. My sister's attorney tried a different approach. She argued that my sister had acted in good faith as healthcare proxy, that medication decisions had been made with nursing home staff involvement, that the financial transfers had been intended as repayable loans. It was a coherent argument until the medical examiner took the stand. The examiner explained, in language the jury followed without difficulty, that the final medication introduced into my mother's regimen had no therapeutic indication for a patient with her documented history. That at the doses administered over 6 weeks, it would have placed sustained stress on the cardiovascular system. That the cardiac episode documented in her file was consistent with, though not exclusively caused by, the effects of that medication at those levels. He said he could not rule out that the medication was a contributing factor in her death. That was enough. My mother's voicemail was played in full. Her voice filled the courtroom, careful and clear and tired in a way that had nothing to do with her age. Several jurors looked down when it finished. The judge did not. When I testified, I said what I knew, and nothing I didn't. I described finding the letter. I described the records I had accessed. I described the conversation at the coffee shop in the same flat. Factual terms I would have used writing a compliance report. My sister's attorney objected twice. Both times were overruled. My sister watched me for the entirety of my time on the stand. She didn't look away once. I don't know what she was looking for. I didn't look back to check. My father attended the last 3 days of the trial. He was 77 and had been living with his brother in Oregon since a mild stroke 2 years earlier. He had followed the preliminary hearings through updates I sent him every evening, but the travel had been too much until the final week. I picked him up from the airport myself. He didn't say much in the car. At one point, looking out the passenger window, he said, "She always made her own mind up. About everything. Your mother. I should have known she'd keep her own records about this too." He sat in the gallery for closing arguments and the verdict. When the jury returned and the forewoman stood, I reached over and held his hand. First count, elder financial abuse. Guilty. Second count, conspiracy to commit fraud. Guilty. For my sister, the additional charge. Negligent administration of medication, resulting in harm. Guilty. My sister closed her eyes when the last verdict came in. Derek stared at the table. Neither of them looked at my father. Neither of them looked at me. Sentencing came 6 weeks later. Derek received 4 years and full restitution. My sister received 7 years, her healthcare proxy permanently revoked, and restitution to match. 7 years was not the same as what my mother had lost. There was no number that would be. But there was a record now, and my mother's name was in it, and the facts of what happened to her were documented in a way that could never be quietly reclassified as natural. After sentencing, my father and I walked out of the courthouse together into late afternoon light that was sharper than I expected. He was quiet for a block. Then he said, "She would have been glad you found the letter." I said, "She left it so someone would." He nodded. He said, "She knew it would be you." I didn't have anything to add to that. We walked to the car, and I drove him back to where he was staying. And we had dinner together in a place my mother would have liked. And we talked about her for 2 hours without talking about any of this. Just her. Just who she was. The dahlias, the crossword, the Sunday calls, the handwriting, that made everything feel permanent. That was what I brought home with me. Not the courtroom. Not the verdict. Not the look on my sister's face when the forewoman stood. Just the handwriting. My name in careful cursive on an envelope she had prepared because she trusted me to do what she couldn't finish. I had finished it. I have my mother's emerald ring now. The one from the wooden box on the top shelf of her closet. The one that had belonged to her mother before her. I wear it on my right hand. I don't need it to remember her, but I think she would have wanted it worn rather than stored. And I have learned, this year more than any other, to take seriously the things the people you love wanted you to have.